All right, good morning. We've got some people trickling in here. We'll give it a few seconds and then we'll get kicked off. All right, why don't we get going? So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. First off, I'll get myself introduced and then we'll hand it to kind of our panel of experts here. My name is Michael Hannon. Been with the organization for about 7 years. I'm currently the field CISO. And today our conversation is centered around public cloud success, which is defined by day two. And the premise is really simple with what we're trying to hit. So generally in our industry, the attention goes to, the pre-sales process, the migration, but most of the outcome for these things gets decided after everything else happens. So I brought a couple individuals to help me kind of talk about what happens after the migration, and what that day two or the phase two kind of pieces look like. We've got around 45 minutes here. We'll get some questions answered, but I wanted you guys to have some firsthand kind of experience or knowledge that can be shared from our group here. And I'll let them share who they are. James, do you want to go first for us?
Sure thing. Thanks, Michael. Hey, folks, I'm James Rurdy. I'm our Chief Cloud Officer. So really my day-to-day responsibilities are I'm responsible for overall strategy and go-to-market for our public cloud practice. I've been at Lightedge for about 6, maybe 7 years now, and I've spent the past dozen or so solely focused on growing, whatever corporation or wherever I've been growing their public cloud practice. So once again, kind of focus on the AWS and Azure side of the house. We can support multiple platforms, whether it be private cloud, VMware, IBM, colocation, and I'm responsible for the public cloud side of the house.
Awesome.
Hi, yeah, and I'm Eileen Curtin. I'm the director of the Cloud Center of Excellence here at Lightedge. Been with the company for about 8.5 years, focused on our public cloud practice. So everything from the design and build of brand new infrastructure up through the care and feeding long-term success of all of our customers.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining us. It wouldn't be fair if I didn't kind of poke you guys a little bit. So between these two experts, you get the promise of what was potentially, done up front from an expert perspective, and then the reality of how things are delivered. So it should be a fun conversation of kind of those two things coming together. I think, James, starting with you, what is the success in the public cloud? Kind of what does that look like for day two as you help guide customers who come in with different problem statements, transformation journeys, directives from, the investment board of directors side? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I'll kind of give my idea pie in the sky, and then obviously kick it to Eileen, whose teams are responsible for actually managing and building and deploying. But I mean, I think success is, you very much view it, success in day 90 is not going to be success in day 365. I think it's a kind of ever evolving type of benchmark you're trying to hit. Obviously, success number one is if you're doing a huge data center migration and getting to the public cloud, actually effectively shutting down those data centers, that's a huge company success. That happens after 3 to 6 months. It's a very good win for a corporation. If in 1 to 2 years your AWS or Azure environment looks the exact same as it did during that final cutover, it's not a success. So the thing is, AWS and Azure, they give you kind of the tools and the capabilities to run your workloads more efficiently, do more with your data. But ultimately, if you don't take advantage of the kind of the bells and whistles that AWS and Azure afford you, then it's really, are you building business outcomes, or are you kind of just building more technical debt? Because the thing is, just running it the same way that you would have and telling the rest of your team that you're on the cloud isn't really the best way to run it. So it's kind of ever evolving and using those hyperscaler cloud native tools to effectively more run your business. Eileen, that once again, that was kind of pie in the sky. Eileen, day to day, how does that actually look?
Yeah, and from a more technical standpoint, right? How does your environment function after 1 year, after 2 years, after 3 years? A lot of the time, folks think that public cloud is set it and forget it, right? We've put these resources here; they're just going to get, supported, AWS, Azure's handling the back end. We don't need to do anything. And that's really not the truth. In public cloud, if we're not supporting those environments on a long-term basis, if we're not making sure that we're updating resources to the newest, the latest and greatest, to native solutions where we can, then you're really not taking advantage of all of the opportunities in the public cloud that you have. There's great cost savings opportunities. There's security savings you can do there. There's efficiencies that you can find when you start looking at modernizing, looking at going more cloud native. And you're also keeping track of those things within your team. You're building those skill sets for your engineers, things like that as well.
Okay. That sounds good. I mean, maybe the simple question to tie this one off is success something that can actually, like a state that you can reach, or is it more just like an ongoing successful cadence or motion that's ongoing?
I think it's an ever evolving target, but it's something you can quantify and I think one of the biggest things to ensure that you are successful is having the right stakeholders established internally, whether that's if you're a more lean team that's working with a partner that can help supplement some of your IT organization. If you're a larger, more mature enterprise or organization, you may think about building out your own internal team of stakeholders, SMEs, Cloud Center of Excellence. It's basically you want people that understand what the kind of the stated outcome is in going to one of the hyperscalers, and you want to be able to track and quantify the metrics that are important to your business, whether that's it's going to depend. If you're a healthcare company, your KPIs are going to be a lot different than a shipping and manufacturing company. But ultimately, it's how is the infrastructure, whether it be hyperscaler or any other infrastructure, how is it benefiting your business? And I think having that right set of stakeholders, establishing those KPIs and reviewing those, whether it's on a monthly, quarterly basis, it kind of keeps everybody in line. And over time, your metrics and your KPIs are going to change. Once again, as I said, like the big thing in those first 3, 6, 9, 12 months, depending on the size of your overall IT infrastructure, it's going to change. The success metrics for a cloud migration are a lot different than when you've been running in AWS for 3, 4, 5 years, and now you want to start leveraging AI. So I think it's a kind of ever evolving thing, but definitely something you can quantify and kind of mark successful, but it's going to change.
And I think that's a really good call out that in the world of business and especially tech, adjacent things or technology that we're doing, the goal lines or the goals, those things do regularly change. So acknowledging that those processes need to be flexible and the things that we've built need to be resilient to those, I think is kind of ever important. I think maybe pivoting a little bit, maybe calling out some of the differences or maybe some of the challenges, like what changes between go live and a year later. And Eileen, maybe I'll start with you because I know you help a lot from a architecture and design phase, but you also live these day in and day out from these customer environments. Yeah, love to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it does change quite a bit, right? From go live and, just to give an example, right? A customer who is living in VMware today or living in on-premises environment today, if they're moving into the public cloud, the most common thing we see is a lift and shift. So that'd be just straight, what do I have today? Just pick it up, move it into public cloud, right? And when we look at that, yes, it works. It's super functional. That gets you into the public cloud. But what you're missing out on is efficiencies. So really, when you're looking at from day one to day 365, how can I be more efficient? Am I right-sized in my resources? A lot of times, on-premises resources are over-provisioned intentionally for those burstable workloads. That doesn't need to happen in public cloud. So looking at, am I right-sized? Where can I start implementing things like auto scaling for those resources that can handle it? And then also what has changed in the environment. One of the great things about public cloud is its flexibility. Anyone can provision pretty much anything if you give them the permission to, but did they provision it the correct way? Did your developer think about security when they released that new server? Is your security appropriately applied across all of your resources? Folks may have built new accounts, new subscriptions. We see sprawl a lot of times, particularly for those customers who are new to a public cloud environment. Their developers aren't used to having that much power or used to having the ability to spin up 10 servers tomorrow if they wanted it. And then even when you take those down, did you remove the volumes? Are you saving yourselves the cost there? It's just a lot more power and a lot more flexibility that accelerates quickly. So making sure that we're keeping track of that over time, and from day one to day 365, what am I doing to make sure that we are staying on track with our long-term goals, reaching, like you were talking about, success is a moving target, but how are we aligning with those long-term goals for the environment and keeping track so that we don't get too far off?
Yeah. James, anything from like a where the expectation gap started from, like the early phases to where it's delivered, or like on the drift piece of it, any
Yeah.
like full things that we can call out there?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it actually has to do with as you start thinking about moving, or even just starting off, moving workloads, or just starting off in the public cloud. Do you have that longer term strategy in mind? Because like for example, AWS has what's called Control Tower, and it's a pre kind of templated set of resources where it allows you to deploy commonly used resources that are in every kind of enterprise environment, whether it be security, networking. It's kind of pre-canned, and it'll allow you in the future to easily deploy resources that align to a pre-configured set of rules. And that's a way, kind of from the jump, to ensure that over time everything that is built and deployed is meeting a common framework. A
Yeah.
lot of times what we see, and we work with companies just either starting their journey to the public cloud, and there's a lot of times where we get brought in where, hey, they had a team, they started building stuff, and we started it 2 years ago, and there was no rhyme or reason as to how we were building it, and stuff just started getting built. So if it kind of to Eileen's point, it's one of those things. It's very easy to get on public cloud. The barrier to entry is pretty low, but it is, if you don't have kind of a defined reference architecture, framework, methodology, and you have business, different parts of the business developing in silos. That is really where that sprawl kind of comes about. I think the better way to do it is, if you know that long term this is your goal, to take a more the measure twice, cut once approach. Like, make sure that you really have kind of your long term framework developed, and then that makes things 3, 6, 24 months down the road a lot easier than trying to put together, basically you've developed resources over the past 18 to 24 months with no real framework in mind, then trying to retrofit everything after the fact. It's doable. It's a lot more work.
Yep, absolutely. Eileen, you may.
It's a great call out, James. That if you start with the right framework from the initial get-go, you're in a such better place a year later because you have that established framework, you have the controls in place, and your folks know what they're doing as they're building out there. So yeah, absolutely great call out.
Yeah, and kind of maybe expanding on that a little bit, the things that make, from what we've seen, things that make it successful is the concept around shared responsibility. So James, I may lean on you, and Eileen, if you want to come over the top on it. In our world, shared responsibility, model, matrix, those different types of things can mean a lot. And maybe speaking to like the pros and cons, and between, the infrastructure partner or managed service partner and the customer, and the cloud provider, how those things play into how we provide a really good cohesive solution.
Yeah, I can kind of kick this off, and then Hannah, I'll probably kick it back to you. As all things security, you're going to know a lot better than me. But I think the biggest thing that we see across our clients and conversations we'll have is, AWS and Azure, they give you the ability, like they have all those resources, security tools in place. AWS and Azure, they are HIPAA, high trust, PCI compliant. Just because you place certain resources there does not inherently make you PCI or HIPAA compliant. So I think it's basically, you have all the building blocks at your disposal. And then once again, I think it really comes down to, are you managing your hyperscale environment yourself? Are you working with a partner? And it's really establishing who's responsible for what. Obviously, AWS and Azure are going to be responsible for like the physical locations, the networking, the compute, all that stuff. But how you're running that, how you're setting it up for high availability, for scalability, ensuring it hits your RPO and RTO, like all those things are still the responsibility, not of the hyperscaler, but of whether it's an end customer or a partner that you're working with. And those need to be very clearly defined. I think like when you think of things like data protection or resiliency. You could meet effectively any RPO and RTO if you wanted, but like if you want a 5 minute RPO, 5 minute RTO, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So it's having the hot setup with a whole bunch of synchronous replication. Like it's all very doable, but that does not just come out of the box. And every once in a while, you see it. Every 6 months, there's a big outage somewhere. If you do not build with that in mind, you will be affected. So it's thinking about things like that. Just that you have such a such a large amount of native services, tools, security offerings, compliance frameworks that these cloud providers provide to you, does not mean you get it right from the jump. The customer or the partner you're working with is ultimately going to be responsible for putting these measures into place.
Yeah, and maybe kind of expand on that. I do think this is one of the most important things that, whether it's irrespective of public cloud environments, infrastructure as general, or just things that we do to operate and align to the goals that we're doing. I think the responsibility matrix or model makes the most sense so that everyone who's involved has a very clear expectation of what component that they're responsible for, whether that's just being informed or they're responsible for managing it themselves or co-management. From the security and compliance world that I've come from, like this is a very powerful thing to understand initially, visually, what each party who's representing, this end solution is, who's doing backups, who's doing patching, is someone informed or, co-managing, all these different pieces is very important. So defining that and working through that kind of the day one, but those pieces for Eileen and her team to deliver, revisiting those on some set of frequency to figure out, what's working and what's not working. As business needs change, do we move one thing from one direction to another? That's very critical. And the places where we see this most materialized for its importance is during like the bad times where, you potentially have organizations that point fingers going, well, I thought you were doing this, and to come to find out it wasn't happening. So those things get flushed out, during the design phase, just during the ongoing providing these things, and also during tests, tabletops, working sessions. If you find them during any one of those things, that's far better than during an outage, during a disaster, during brief interruptions or customer needs. You'd rather flush all those things out before. So I think this is one of the most critical things that organizations can do as we work with third parties, is to sit down and kind of map these things out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think both of you guys touched on this a little bit, but more thinking about that shared responsibility model with the public cloud. The way to think about it, the highest level that I can approach it, is the provider, AWS, Azure, right, is responsible for the security of the cloud. Like they're going to make sure that that data center is secured, that those resources are locked down, that no one's physically accessing them, things like that. And then as a customer, you and your partner are responsible for the security in the cloud. So just because you're on AWS, just because you're on Azure, this doesn't exclude you from having to patch, having to make sure that you're running not end of life resources. Like we're looking at Server 2012, Windows Server 2012 coming end of life, right? That's a huge platform. There's lots of companies all around the world on Server 2012 still. As that comes end of life, that is the customer's responsibility and or their partner, something that a partner can definitely help you with, to upgrade those to a current server level. That's not AWS, that's not Azure's problem. They're not going to upgrade those servers for you. So just because you're on a public cloud doesn't exclude you from responsibility of managing those resources. And I think that's an important caveat that folks don't always understand as they're moving into public cloud.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think maybe segueing into something you guys have maybe lightly danced around, and I think, Eileen, you hit this in some of your opening. So control gives us a lot of flexibility in what we're doing, the ability to control what we're working in and work with others who have given us control to manage what we're doing. But control at scale turns into sprawl. So what can organizations do from like a discipline perspective to hold the line? Because far too often we've seen some surprises based on the sprawl via security risk or cost or other things like that. Eileen, I may pass this to you first. What thoughts do you have on kind of control and what works, maybe what doesn't work, and just some observations?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is RBAC control. It's, the easiest thing to do is to give everyone admin and say, don't do the bad thing. But that doesn't happen, right? If you give someone access, they're gonna go and use that access. So making sure that as you're moving into public cloud or as you've existed in the public cloud, that access is controlled by role. We're using least privileged access across the board. Really the bread and butter of what security has always been in technology still applies in AWS and in Azure. We need to make sure that we're limiting roles, that we're putting in controls so that if a mistake happens, the scope and the scale of that mistake is limited. Both Azure and AWS give you control policies that can be put in place that will help to limit the scope and the scale of any issues that occur. You can monitor your spend, you can monitor your access control logs. Things like that are in place from the get-go, so that if and when something happens, because we know humans aren't infallible, if and when something happens, you're prepared for the response, and that response is accessible to you and is limited in scope to what you actually have to correct.
That's awesome. James, anything over the top on that one?
No, I think Eileen kind of nailed it. I mean, the biggest thing is the sooner you can kind of put these principles or these principles into practice, I think the better. It's a lot easier to start with these controls from the beginning rather than retrofit them in at the end. Obviously just kind of keeping everything with security compliance, all that in mind is going to be very important. I think kind of just one extra thing there is, and Eileen kind of touched on it a little bit, is you can do a lot in AWS and Azure. You can do it a lot quicker than you can in other environments. So that also does bring in the risk of things going south a lot quicker. So the more that you have, and one of the things we do is we leverage infrastructure as code a lot. So if you need to roll back something, it's a lot easier to do that to just pull back some code as opposed to just manually going in and having to do a million config networking changes all at once. So I think once again, the more you can design your environment with kind of future state already in mind, you want it to be able to scale quickly, but you're going to need to think about some of the things I was talking about for sure.
And just to add on top of that, James, yes, it's best to do day one. If you could do it day one, absolutely put those controls in day one. But that's not always feasible. And sometimes you've inherited, we've seen customers where they've inherited an environment that maybe didn't get a lot of attention. Maybe they lost their expert in AWS and no one's really known how to manage that environment for a few years. That's definitely not an unsurmountable task. That can be fixed. If you didn't do it day one, the best time to do it is now. So put those controls in now, put that access control, get that RBAC in place today to help future protection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the next place for us to go is really getting specific on security. You guys are starting to hit that. So
I think we'll just be quiet. You can.
No. I know. I like, obviously this is my space and I love being passionate about security and compliance, but you guys live this every day. So I'll kick it to you guys first, and I'm happy to kind of jump in. But maybe just the overall like sentiment and feeling. How different is security and compliance in public cloud versus private? The traditional infrastructure layers.
Yeah,
James, you touched on it already, I think, right? The speed.
Mm-hmm. But I think that the bigger thing is like ultimately the principles of security haven't changed. Just because you're in the public cloud now does not mean like, yeah, let's just keep all the ports and networks open. Like none of that changes. It's just the methodology and how you do it, the tools you're leveraging to achieve kind of your compliance security framework. It's a little different. It's going to be a lot quicker, more automated if you're doing it the right way. But ultimately, your goal for any environment you're supporting is it needs to be as secure as possible. It needs to meet your specific business and potentially compliance requirements. You need to adhere to any regulatory rules. Just because you're in AWS or Azure, if you're running VMware, if you're running IBM, those are also in place. It's more fundamentally the tools and the tools that are supporting it are going to help you kind of achieve your goals. And then I think within and kind of what you'll see within the hyperscalers is, I mean, like I think AWS now has over 500 native AWS offerings, like platform as a service offerings. So, it really blurs the line between infrastructure and third-party applications. So there's a lot of stuff that would count as technically like a native AWS or Azure security offering that could effectively replace some third-party off-the-shelf tools. So it's, what are you going to put in place to support your environment? And then once again, that kind of goes back to, you could start on, I'm gonna pick on AWS. You could start on AWS and just look and say, wow, there's 35 native security offerings that I could implement today in my environment. You got to ask yourself, why are you implementing this? Are you just doing that because you have all these tools at your disposal? Like, who's going to support them? Who's going to monitor them? Who's going to remediate based off of what's found? If nobody's doing any of those things, you're just spending a lot of money on additional tools you're not using.
Couldn't agree more. Maybe pivoting, are there specific risks or vulnerabilities that deserve more attention to public cloud versus private?
Yeah, I think like I mentioned, James mentioned as well, the speed with which things can be spun up in your environments, particularly with AI workloads and the accessibility of them in public cloud. It's very easy for a malicious actor, if they were to gain access to your environment, to start spinning up resources. We saw it a number of years ago with bot farms. Credentials would get out there, they'd be leaked somehow, usually through human error. Humans are usually your soft spot. Human error, credentials are out there. All of a sudden, your environment has a bot farm in it, and that needs to go get shut down. How quickly can you identify that? How quickly are you able to remediate, close it down, lock it as it's out there? And like James said, there are a lot of great native tools. Both AWS and Azure have a great repertoire of security tools out of the box in their environments. You do, however, have to configure them and put them in your environment and make sure that they're applicable for the services that you're running. Yeah, there are, like James said, over 500 different services you can apply here. Are you running all of them? Probably not. I don't think anyone's using every single service and every single platform. And different types of security tooling is applicable to different types of resources. Even the tools that we currently use on premises may or may not work for you in the public cloud. So for a customer who's looking at moving into AWS that currently has on-premises resources, making sure that whatever security tooling you're using today works in public cloud, and if not, supplementing it with those native tools to make sure that you are fully covered.
Yeah, I'll second that for sure. That especially as we continue to enter this hybrid workload environment, people take for granted the tools that they've maybe been using from a legacy perspective, and the lack of oversight or control, or single pane of glass. I know we always harp on that from a security, but it does matter. And then the other thing I would hit is the speed and velocity is 100% both a pro and con. Like, we love how quickly we can spin this stuff up, and when it's working, it's great because we need that stuff and we need to be able to turn it back down. But the speed of which attackers can take advantage and exfiltrate things, and they're using all those different tools, for and against us, those different types of things. So it just keeps us on our toes. Absolutely, to be able to monitor and detect, sprawl and growth within these things, both from a cost perspective, but also from a security landscape, and putting the right controls in place day one to kind of prevent those things, I think are critical, because when it does go bad, it goes really bad, really fast. And it can be hard to clean up without the right things in place. So I think that's a great place. We did get a question in the Q&A area, and I think it's probably a good place to pivot. So say, someone has inherited an AWS or Azure public cloud environment that's been running for, a year or more with very little oversight. Eileen, you mentioned someone that maybe has transitioned out that, had that inherent knowledge. What are the first things that, we'd recommend, or that we kind of, what's the go forward things that people should check to check that environment?
Yeah, so the very first thing I'd look for is what is in the environment. A lot of times folks just don't know, or they have some things in one region, some things in another. So the very first thing I'd do is do an assessment of what is in the environment. Get that network diagram created, understand what actually lives in your resources and what are you paying for. Um, Number two, I also look at who has access. Are you connected to a single sign-on? Are you uh, just having individual IAM users? Who's in there and what have they been doing? So that'll give you a really nice picture of who is actually working in your environment. What are they accessing? Which of these resources are actually being used today versus maybe just sitting out there and have been kind of ignored for a while. So those would be the first things I would look at is just identify what you have and who you have. And then both AWS and Azure offer you really helpful recommendations through their trusted advisor and Azure advisor fields. They're not super in-depth unless you're paying for the additional services, but right out of the box, you can get some really nice initial assessments of what are high-risk security issues you have, what are some initial cost savings opportunities you have there. It's a great place to start. There's obviously a lot deeper insights you can get by bringing in some experts to help you review the environment, things like that. But that's a great place to start. That's kind of that low barrier of entry.
And I've
And
seen
I
some of
have
the sorry, James. I was going to say I've seen some of the outputs of that, and they're a very good starting place.
Yeah.
So
I would just kind of add there, kind of a combination of the 2 points Eileen highlighted, like what's in there and who's accessing the environment. I think the other big thing we got to focus on is once we know what's in the environment, it's not necessarily who else is diving in and like technically supporting it, but it's who owns these apps, like who owns these workloads. Like what? So all right, now we have there's a whole bunch of Kinesis streams and Redshift and all this stuff in US West. Okay, cool. Why is that there? And what is the business unit that is supporting? And it, like usually we're going to see this. We'll work with companies that have done acquisitions, so they're inheriting these environments, and they could inherit a bunch of sprawl. And what what we would kind of advise them on is like, all right, now you know it's in the environment. Why is it all actually running? You got big data streams running somewhere because you had a marketing department like needed this for a project 6 months ago, and they just got left on. So it's those type of things. It's understanding what's running, but ultimately, especially in a larger environment, like if you have multiple accounts, siloed resources, is understanding who are the business and application owners that ultimately need, like you would want them to justify what this is doing there and what value it's actually providing to the business.
yeah, I think that's a great call out. Eileen, I may pivot the next one because it kind of transitions really well. So what else have we not spoken to today that falls into that day two operations that people tend to overlook? I think you've hit on a few of them really well, but I think there's still a few surprises that people may hear from you related to kind of the gotchas in there.
Yeah, so the number one thing would be cost. Same thing, kind of the concern around security, acceleration, all of these things. Your costs can also expand exponentially if you're not paying attention to it. We see those costs growing over time a lot with a lot of environments, particularly if they've lost key resources. That resources that aren't being used anymore are left behind. A resource that was spun down, but we forgot to clean up the disk volumes, or we left out this database because no one really knows what it does, but we're a little scared to delete it. That's the kind of costs that are just recurring in the public cloud. You're going to get charged every single month for that resource, whether you use it or not, if it's sitting out there. So really keeping an eye on those costs, setting budgets, setting alerts around spend, making sure that those kind of things are in place, tagging appropriately so you know who's responsible for it. All of those are really important that folks tend to overlook until it's an emergency, and now we have to figure out why we're spending 3 times our budget on the public cloud.
Yeah. I think maybe staying on cost as well, because like it's just so important, and like the trade-off gets real fast there. What's the balance between like lowest cost, best functional performance? Is there an ideal midpoint when you guys, and James and Eileen, you both kind of again see this from the what is the art of the possible versus what we're seeing from a day to day? I don't know which one of you wants to go first, but is there an ideal midpoint?
I mean, I think it's kind of a cop out of an answer, but it truly depends on each company. If you're a large enterprise organization with corporate defined like RPOs and RTOs, then you have to build it to support whatever those kind of corporate mandates are. There's no getting around it. So, but I also think we never want to build it. We want to build and support an environment where we're very confident that a customer is not spending like $1 more than they need to. But we don't ever want them to be running an environment that is bare bones and cheap as possible, because that is where performance, uptime, all that stuff truly starts to become a problem. I mean, I think like you could technically just build everything in a single availability zone and cross your fingers that it works. And that'll work most of the time, but when it doesn't, you're going to feel it. So I think it's deploying an environment that is going to meet your defined, and a lot of these times we'll talk to customers and they don't have any defined, like it's another thing that doing this, like it's an exercise for organizations that if you're designing it and you're asking the right questions, some of these things are going to pop up. Like you may find out that there's no KPIs for uptime or data retention or like downtime at all. So one of the first steps is figuring out like, okay, what can we tolerate? And now we will build an environment that supports our internal KPIs. And that I think is like, if we're talking a good middle point, it's truly building an environment that's going to meet your defined internal KPIs and not a penny more. And I also think part of this too is like, if you can move to more cloud native services, they're fully managed. They're going to scale up and down depending on resource consumption. So if you're moving a bunch of workloads and just running on Azure VMs or AWS EC2 instances, once again, you're not necessarily taking, like, I wouldn't say you're taking advantage of the hyperscalers. You can do that in other places. So it's like, if you are running it on like, even if you are running it on EC2, like ensuring your environment is stateless. So, or like your application is stateless, so it can scale up and down. If you have something where you need block storage attached on an EC2 instance, like scaling is going to be a lot harder. So you are stuck with a more static type of environment. So part of this too is looking at like, you're going to have to do some application re-architecture to ensure that your environment can scale up and down as needed. So as you can tell, I'm rambling a lot, and there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but ultimately it's defining what your internal KPIs are, RPO, RTO, data retention, all that good stuff, and then building an environment that's going to support what you need.
I think that's fair. Eileen, I'm not sure if you have anything for that one.
Yeah, I mean, it truly is what James was saying around what is your corporate policy. It's more of a business decision than anything else. That's one of the great advantages of public cloud, is that you do have essentially unlimited scope to expand into. So if you want the fastest machine you've ever seen, sure, we can build that for you. But you're going to pay for it. So what is the business decision around what performance you need versus what you're willing to pay? And the other opportunity here is that you can take advantage of scaling in the cloud, of turning down resources when you're not using them. It's one of the great things about public cloud, is that just because you have a resource doesn't mean it needs to run 24/7, and you don't need to pay for it 24/7. So keeping an awareness of what's a development resource, what's something that's only used Monday through Friday. Can we turn that off on the weekends and save money there? Where can we take advantage of savings plans or reserved instances? Both AWS and Azure offer reserved instances and savings plans on both databases and machine compute resources. So even if you're not running a traditional, EC2 or VMware environment, you likely have a database somewhere. How can you save money on that database? So taking advantage of those opportunities in the public cloud really will help you with spend long term.
Absolutely. And I think, it's great to watch our teams work with, prospective and current customers to really challenge them on what those goals and that alignment looks like, because it's not always, doing exactly what the customer wants to do, because sometimes there are some pushes on where we can be more efficient with some of that spend or focus on some of the alignment. And that maybe takes us to the next spot of like, what can a partner actually bring here? Where does the hand holding that we can, or others can help, and where does a customer, generally own this themselves? And I'll open it up to both of you guys.
I mean, I think you're probably better.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the big thing a partner can bring here is we've been there. We've seen this. It's unusual for a customer to come to us and us have not seen this problem before, right? We know how to help someone save money in the cloud. We know how to measure your performance to make sure that your resources are optimized. We know how to clean up when you've inherited an environment that no one else knows what to do with and no one's touched in 3 years. We've been through all of this. We've seen these environments, and not just one. We've seen a lot of environments in a lot of different structures. So we're able to have those conversations with our customers around what their long-term goals are, what success means to them in their AWS or Azure environment. So as a partner, we're able to come in, be those experts, help them guide them along their journey, and clean up anything that might have been misconfigured along the way when we're looking at a day two type environment.
I would just add one kind of thing there, and it does ultimately it does put a little bit of the onus back on the end customer or the end organization. The partner is not going to know your business better than you do. So there are certain, like, in theory, you could offload everything to a partner. To me, that creates a little bit of a risk, because you do need people internally, even if it's just one or two SMEs or stakeholders, to be able to translate your business requirements to a partner. A partner can make educated guesses, but ultimately is not going to know your business as well as you do. So it still should be a mutual relationship. That, like, it shouldn't just be throwing everything over to the partner. There are some partners that will say, yes, we can do that, no problem. Eventually down the road, you are going to see that does create a few gaps. So I think really the best way to kick off a relationship with any partner is to truly establish who is responsible for what, and identify, that, like, hey, internally, we don't have somebody that can explain this application. Okay, it's better to know that now up front, and we can create workarounds or kind of stopgaps for it, as opposed to 6 months down the line, the application goes down and everyone's kind of caught wondering who can actually support this.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And, we haven't mentioned it to this point, so maybe I'll make this kind of the last question to the group. And then we can take any other questions that come in from the Q&A section. But AI, like, we literally haven't mentioned it whatsoever. What does success look like here related to the public cloud and working with third parties within this space?
Yeah, I can kind of kick it off, because obviously we're not going to go through a webinar, especially on a hyperscaler, to not talk about AI. I think that the big thing is there's so much hype around it, and obviously it's real. It's kind of the same way, like, there was a while 10 years ago, people said, like, is this public cloud thing a real thing? And obviously it is. I think we're starting to get to that point with AI where it's like, it's not going away. It's very beneficial. But I would kind of caution organizations to just say, we got to start putting a bunch of stuff in AI without any real strategy around it. It's more, what business problems are we trying to solve? And then it's figuring out, how do we use AI to actually go ahead and solve those problems. It's not just throw a bunch of data into the hyperscalers and just start clicking, go into the panel of native AWS services and start clicking away. It's like, we have a couple organizations. We do a lot in the manufacturing space. So we've got a handful of organizations running really big ERP systems. So that's where you can, basically plug in a few things into AWS. You can leverage SageMaker or some of the other tools. And hey, why are orders typically delayed at the last week of every month? And you're going to be able to get a lot more actionable insights from that, as opposed to just kind of moving a bunch of stuff into data lakes without a real defined problem that you're trying to solve. I think that the big thing is, you've got all these tools at your disposal, but don't just start using them, incurring costs, until you know what outcome and problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah. Eileen, anything over the top on that one?
Yeah, no, I think if you've got unlimited money, go ahead and throw all your resources into AI. But no, really, starting with a defined goal is the most important part there. I know we hear AI on everything. If you don't know what your goal is, or you don't have a purpose behind why you're starting to use AI tools, it gets very expensive very quickly, and you're not really going to see an outcome because you didn't have one. So making sure you have a defined goal and a structure to what you want. Public cloud has great tools to assist you with that. The native SageMaker, the Copilot resources in Azure, all of that's out there to help you once you have that goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thought around all these different things is, every piece of this is super enabling to an organization that is going through transformation or growth or just steady state business. It's super powerful. And we hope to help, customers along on that journey. And I think the through line today is that the day two is not a phase that there's any finish line for. It's just an operating posture and like a ready position that we keep. And so if you take like just one thing away from today, it's just the environment that you audited at go live. So the one that maybe we designed is not the environment that you maybe have, day 2 or day 50, whatever that is. And the gap between those two is where, from my mind, risk, it lives. And so it's the place that we have to monitor and keep checked, especially as we work with third parties. So Eileen and James, like, thank you guys so much. I always enjoyed, doing sessions with you guys. And to those in the audience, like, we really appreciate it. It doesn't look like we have any additional questions that came in, so we'll probably wrap here. But we just really appreciate the time. And James and Eileen, thanks for the thoughtful conversation as always.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Bye, guys.